All right, I guess we will get started. Welcome. So this panel is called Abolishing Deportation, Migration as a Human Right. And I will just give you a brief intro into what we were thinking or the idea we had when we put this panel together. So as immigration policy is reshaped under the Biden administration, public conversation is at an inflection point. Record deportation numbers under Obama and intensified oppression of immigrant communities under Trump have led advocates and organizers to critically examine the immigration enforcement infrastructure. Demands to abolish ICE and eliminate the practice of imprisoning immigrants are growing. This discourse is informed by and connected to prison industrial complex abolition, or PIC abolition. However, abolition has a distinct place in immigration law and policy. It may include the abolition of ICE and the elimination of deportation and all immigration restrictions. This panel will hopefully examine how abolition of detention would functionally end deportations. We hope that the audience walks away from this panel understanding the unique role that abolition plays in the immigrant rights movement. What does it mean to abolish ICE, not just the agency, but its carceral function? And we also want to draw the connection between abolition of immigration restrictions and open borders. And we have wonderful speakers today. It's my pleasure to first introduce Sama Sisay. Sama is an immigration practitioner and PIC abolition organizer. She is a Bertha Justice Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights, where she specializes in challenging inhumane immigration policies and abusive police practices. During her prior 2-year fellowship at African Services Committee, Sama represented undocumented Black immigrant women impacted by gender violence. Sama was born in Liberia and immigrated to the US with her family at a young age during the country's civil war. So thank you, Sama, and I will pass the microphone to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being with us today. That was such a warm introduction. And it's so great that we're having this conversation because I think a few years ago when people thought about immigration, our thoughts were very much focused on reform and on citizenship and on, doing things to try and reform the system. And it's just very refreshing that we're at a place now where people understand that abolition fits within immigration and the work that we're doing for liberation. So just to add, I wouldn't be where I am today and be able to talk about what I'm talking about without the work that I do with a coalition called Survived and Punished New York. Survived and Punished is a coalition that uses prison industrial complex abolition as a framework and a practice towards ending the criminalization, imprisonment, policing, and surveillance of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And we know this work is important because the type of targeting that happens under the PIC is especially true for Black, queer, Indigenous, and immigrant survivors. And everything that I know about abolition, I know because of people who have been harmed by the system, people who are survivors in so many ways, whether it's of interpersonal violence or of state violence. That's really important because oftentimes when we talk about abolition, people think of it as this intellectual project or this utopian idea as if people are not fighting and living abolition every day, right, in their everyday lives because they've been failed by the state that claims to want to provide public safety and protection. So what I'm going to do is just briefly provide an overview of abolition and then try and really help folks understand how it applies to the immigrant rights movement, to the immigrant liberation movement that we are all a part of. So over the past year and a half, after the killings that occurred of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, we saw this idea of abolition enter the mainstream, if you will. More people who, you wouldn't expect to be having these conversations about abolition were asking questions, people's parents, their neighbors. And I think why this was so important and why it happened is we're all having the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So we saw that people were struggling, losing their job, being very much afraid of the public health implications of COVID-19, losing loved ones. And yet, in that same light, instead of seeing the state really step up to care for people, to provide them with the things that they needed to get through the pandemic, what we saw was mass killings of Black people, right? We saw the funding or overfunding of institutions that, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, cause death, right? And so I think it raised this question of what is the purpose, right? If, we're struggling and the claim is that the police, the prison system, the immigration system are here to provide us with safety and protection, and in reality, what it's causing is death and taking away money that could be going to providing other forms of safety for people who need a system. I think that conversation was really, really important. But it's important to also say that abolition has existed for a long time, and there have been people who have been writing, but also living abolition for many, many years. It's very much steeped in Black radical tradition. When you think about the abolition of slavery and the various movements that followed after that. But talk about abolition, what we're talking about is prison industrial complex abolition. So I'm taking these definitions from Critical Resistance, which is an amazing group that organizes and does work around PIC abolition. So according to Critical Resistance, prison industrial complex abolition is a term that describes the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems, right? And therefore, PIC abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance. And I always like to say, because I think it's so important, abolition is both a practical tool and a long-term goal, right? So it's not just this utopian idea, it's something that we use now to really fight for the future that we want. So how does this fit into immigration, right? I think a lot of people at this moment, when they think of abolition, think of the defund police movement that has really risen over the past year. But we would say the defund the police applies to many institutions, right? Including ICE, right? So including all the agencies that enforce immigration, because what we see in the United States is that while this rhetoric of immigration being the civil matter, in reality, immigration and the criminal system are very much connected. And the ways in which people are surveilled and punished by the state is very much tied to similarly how the police in the criminal legal system punish people, right? And so within the immigrant rights movement, there's a need for us to really connect with folks who are doing criminal work around the criminal system and doing abolition work, because we know when you organize with Black immigrants, for instance, that's like been the majority of the work I've been doing, or people who live at the intersection of various oppressive systems, your work has to span across different movements to be effective and to capture the breadth of injustice, right? And so we can't just have the immigrant rights movement by itself in this corner and act like it's different from what's happening within the criminal system. And so there have been a lot of organizers and people who have been doing to really make that. When we're saying PIC abolition, when we're saying abolish the police or defund the police or abolish prisons, that includes immigration enforcement and surveillance. So some quick examples of how this has really